Picture a vast empire rising from the mist-shrouded valleys of ancient Mesoamerica, its towering temples glinting in the sun, its warriors clad in jaguar pelts and eagle feathers, its very heartbeat pulsing with the rhythm of war. This was the Aztec Empire, a civilization forged not just by gold and gods, but by the relentless clash of steel and sacrifice. Warfare wasn't merely a means of conquest for the Aztecs, it was the lifeblood of their society, a sacred duty that shaped their destiny. Every battle was a dance with destiny, every victory a step closer to glory, and every defeat a lesson etched in blood. Imagine standing on the battlefield beside these warriors, hearing the thunder of drums, the shriek of conch shell trumpets, the cacophony of thousands of warriors locking in combat. The Aztecs didn't just fight for land or power, they fought to honor their gods, to prove their courage, and to carve their names into history. Their wars weren't just conflicts, they were spectacles of strategy and brutality, where cunning generals and fearless fighters decided the fate of entire civilizations. And among these countless clashes, 30 battles would rise above the rest, 30 moments where courage, chaos, and cunning collided to reshape the ancient world. From the legendary siege of Tenochtitlan to the shadowy skirmishes in the jungles of Oaxaca, each of these battles holds secrets waiting to be uncovered. Some were triumphs that expanded the empire's reach, while others were devastating defeats that exposed its vulnerabilities. But every single one left an indelible mark on history, influencing everything from politics to religion to the very identity of Mesoamerica. So join us as we step onto these forgotten battlefields, where the echoes of clashing obsidian swords still linger, and where the fate of an empire and a way of life was decided one brutal fight at a time. The story of the Aztec Empire isn't just about kings and temples, it's about the battles that made them legendary. And trust us, you won't want to miss a single one. The story of the Aztec Empire begins not with a crown or a treaty, but with a desperate struggle for survival, a battle fought not against an enemy, but against the wilderness itself. In the year 1325, the Mexica people, weary and exiled, found themselves standing on the swampy shores of Lake Texcoco. According to legend, their priests had prophesied a sign, an eagle perched on a cactus, gripping a serpent in its talons. When they finally spotted this omen on a tiny island in the lake, they knew they had reached their destined home. But claiming this land would require more than divine favor. It would demand blood and steel. The Mexica were outnumbered, undermanned, and surrounded by rival city-states who saw them as trespassers. To secure their place, they waged a series of brutal skirmishes against the Tepanecs and other local powers, using guerrilla tactics honed through years of hardship. Their victory wasn't just military, it was spiritual. The eagle on the cactus became more than a symbol. It was proof that the gods had chosen them, a divine mandate to build their great city, Tenochtitlan. Archaeologists have since uncovered remnants of early fortifications and ceremonial platforms beneath modern Mexico City, physical evidence of that hard-fought beginning. This wasn't just the founding of a capital, it was the birth of an identity. Every stone laid in Tenochtitlan echoed with the resolve of those early battles, a resolve that would define the Aztecs for centuries. Their humble start as underdogs fueled their relentless ambition, turning a swampy refuge into the heart of an empire. And when future generations looked back, they didn't just see a city, they saw a destiny written in obsidian and fire. By 1428, the swamp-born city of Tenochtitlan was no longer a ragged refugee settlement, it was a rising power, hungry for its place in the sun. But the Tepanec Empire still loomed over the Valley of Mexico like a shadow, its grip tightening under the tyrannical rule of Maxtla, a king who saw the upstart Aztecs as little more than insects to crush. When Maxtla assassinated the Mexica ruler Chimalpopoca, it wasn't just a political murder, it was a declaration of war. The Aztecs faced annihilation unless they struck first. What followed wasn't just a battle, it was a masterclass in strategy and betrayal. The Aztec ruler Itzcoatl knew his people couldn't topple the Tepenecs alone. So he forged an alliance with two other rising powers, the scholarly city-state of Texcoco, ruled by the poet King Nezahualcoyotl, and the strategic stronghold of Tlaxcala. Together, these three became the legendary Triple Alliance, a pact that would reshape Mesoamerica. The war began not with a grand charge, but with calculated precision. Texcoco's engineers sabotaged Tepenec water supplies, Tlaxcalan spies sowed dissent among Maxtla's vassals, and Aztec shock troops launched lightning raids. The final siege of Azcapotzalco, the Tepenec capital, was a bloodbath. Obsidian swords shattered against cotton armor, fire arrows turned the city's wooden palisades into infernos, and Maxtla's once proud army found itself surrounded on all sides. When the gates finally fell, the victors didn't just sack the city, they erased it. Temples were toppled, records burned, and the Tepenec name was scrubbed from history as thoroughly as if they'd never existed. This wasn't merely a military victory, it was the birth certificate of an empire. The spoils were divided not by greed, but by meticulous agreement. Tenochtitlan took the lion's share of tribute, Texcoco oversaw legal and artistic matters, and Tlaxcala managed military logistics. This triple alliance became the engine of Aztec expansion, a blueprint for conquest that would stretch from the Gulf Coast to the Pacific. And at its core lay a chilling lesson: the Aztecs didn't just defeat their enemies. They rewrote the world to make it seem like those enemies had never mattered at all. But the Aztecs didn't always fight to conquer. Some battles were waged not for land or tribute, but for something far more sacred, the very favor of the gods. In the year 1454, as drought gripped the Valley of Mexico and famine gnawed at the empire's edges, the Aztec ruler Moctezuma I faced a crisis no army could solve. The sun, it was said, demanded nourishment not with rain or grain, but with human hearts. And so the Aztecs turned to their oldest rivals, the Tlaxcalans and the Huixotzinca, not with the usual thirst for destruction, but with a startling proposal: a ceremonial battle where death wasn't the cost of defeat, but its very purpose. This was the first Xochitl flower war. Unlike the brutal campaigns against the Tepenecs, these clashes followed strict ritual rules. Armies met on prearranged battlegrounds like sacred stages, warriors adorned in vibrant feathers rather than battle-scarred armor. The goal wasn't to kill indiscriminately, but to capture enemies alive, honorable prisoners destined for the altars of Tenochtitlan's Great Pyramid. Historians have debated the true motives behind these wars for centuries. Were they mere religious theater, a cynical ploy to weaken rivals without full-scale conflict, or something far more ingenious? The answer lies in the dual genius of the flower wars. For the Aztecs, these battles were a divine bargain. By feeding the sun with the blood of captured warriors, they ensured crops would grow and disasters would relent. But they also served as a relentless training ground. Young Aztec soldiers, many yet to earn their first kill, could test their skills against seasoned Tlaxcalan fighters without the chaos of total war. The Tlaxcalans, meanwhile, saw these clashes as a chance to prove their own might and to funnel Aztec aggression away from their cities. It was a deadly dance choreographed by mutual need. Yet over time, the flower wars became a double-edged sword. By sparing Tlaxcala and Huixotzinco from outright conquest, the Aztecs allowed these rivals to grow stronger, their warriors tempered in countless ritual battles. When the Spanish arrived decades later, they would find in Tlaxcala not a broken foe, but a hardened ally eager to turn generations of ceremonial combat into outright vengeance. The gods may have been satisfied, but the cost of keeping them fed would echo far beyond the temple steps. And so, what began as a sacred solution became a slow-burning threat. Proof that even in warfare designed to sustain life, the Aztecs were playing a game where every victory carried the seeds of future ruin. The lush basin of Lake Chalco had fed empires for centuries, its fertile shores thick with maize, beans, and the lifeblood of Mesoamerican power, food. By 1465, Chalco wasn't just another city-state. It was the breadbasket of the Valley of Mexico, a prize so valuable that the Aztecs were willing to wage war for 10 grueling years to claim it. But Chalco's warriors were no ordinary foes. Shielded by marshlands and bolstered by alliances, they had repelled invaders for generations. This wouldn't be a battle of brute force, it would be a war of wits, endurance, and ruthless innovation. The Aztecs began not with swords but with starvation. Knowing a direct assault on Chalco's island strongholds would be suicide, they orchestrated a slow strangulation. Engineers diverted canals to drain the marshes, turning natural defenses into barren mudflats. Scouts intercepted supply barges under cover of darkness, leaving Chalco's granaries emptier with each passing moon. But the true stroke of genius came from an unexpected quarter propaganda. Aztec spies spread whispers among Chalco's subjects, tales of their rulers hoarding food while commoners starved, of the Triple Alliance's mercy to those who surrendered. When dissent erupted in outlying villages, the Aztecs didn't crush the rebels, they armed them, turning Chalco's own people into a fifth column. Yet Chalco refused to break. Their warriors launched daring night raids, burning Aztec siege engines and slipping back into the reeds like ghosts. The conflict dragged on until the Aztecs unveiled their ultimate weapon, not a machine but a spectacle. On a blood-red dawn, they paraded thousands of captured Chalco soldiers in chains past the city walls, not as broken prisoners, but as well-fed converts singing hymns to Huitzilopochtli. The message was undeniable. Resistance meant death, but surrender meant survival and even honor. When Chalco finally fell in 1475, the victory reshaped the empire's destiny. The fertile fields that had once fed rivals now flowed with tribute to Tenochtitlan, maize, amaranth, and even the prized blue dye from Chalco's snails, a color reserved for royalty. But the true prize was strategic. With Chalco's ports under Aztec control, trade routes from the southern highlands flowed directly into their coffers. This wasn't just conquest, it was the moment the Aztecs transformed from warriors into architects of an economic machine. And yet, in their triumph lay an unspoken tension. The same tactics of division and psychological warfare that broke Chalco would one day be used against them when a new enemy arrived from across the sea. The steamy jungles of the Gulf Coast were a world away from the highland basins where the Aztecs had forged their empire, humid, thick with venomous snakes, and teeming with enemies who fought not in orderly ranks but from the shadows. Yet in 1480, Moctezuma I set his sights on this untamed frontier, not just for conquest but for something far more precious: vanilla, cotton, and the shimmering feathers of tropical birds that adorned the robes of kings. The Totonac people, masters of these lush lands, had no idea their wealth would make them the next target in the Aztec march toward domination. This wasn't a war of quick raids or flower war rituals, it was a grueling campaign of adaptation. Aztec generals, accustomed to the crisp air of the highlands, now faced sweltering heat where metal armor rusted in days and fungus rotted their sandals. Totonac warriors used the terrain like a weapon, luring Aztec patrols into mangrove swamps where arrows hissed from the canopy above. But the Aztecs had one advantage the Totonacs couldn't match: sheer logistical brilliance. Engineers built floating causeways across rivers, allowing supply columns to bypass ambush points. Scouts trained macaws to mimic Totonac battle cries, turning the jungle's own sounds against its defenders. The turning point came not at a grand battle, but at a river crossing near the city of Sempoala. Totonac chieftains, confident the rains would flood the fords and trap the invaders, awoke to find the Aztecs had dismantled an entire forest overnight. Using ropes woven from maguey fibers, they'd lashed logs into floating bridges strong enough to bear armored columns. When the Totonacs regrouped for a final stand, they found their sacred temples already draped in Aztec banners, not from frontal assault, but from flanking maneuvers through terrain even locals deemed impassable. Victory here wasn't just about territory. The Gulf Coast became a funnel for treasures that would fuel Tenochtitlan's golden age: jade from the Motagua Valley, cacao from the Soconusco, and the iridescent Quetzal feathers that adorned the headdress of every Aztec emperor. But beneath the glittering tribute flowed a darker current. The Totonacs never forgot their humiliation. When strangers with pale skin and thunder weapons landed on their shores decades later, these conquered people would seize the chance to rewrite history, proving that even the most carefully secured trade routes couldn't outrun the consequences of empire. The northern frontier of the Aztec Empire was a land of contradictions: lush valleys dotted with towering pyramids, yet peopled by warriors who painted their bodies in jagged stripes and spoke a tongue as foreign to Nahuatl ears as the howl of jungle beasts. In 1487, the Emperor Ahuitzotl set his sights on these lands, the Huasteca, a region whose name meant the place of the ceiba tree, but which the Aztecs would come to remember as the proving ground of their imperial might. Unlike the Gulf Coast campaigns, where riches like vanilla and feathers had sweetened the sting of battle, the Huastec lands offered no such obvious treasures. This was a war of pure expansion, fought not for goods but for glory, and it would test the limits of Aztec logistics, endurance, and adaptability like never before. Supply lines stretched thin as spider silk across the rugged terrain. Where the Aztecs were masters of lake-borne transport, the Huastecas' rivers ran wild and unpredictable, their banks thick with ambush parties. Porters carrying maize and beans from the highlands collapsed under the weight of their loads, their sandals sinking into clay turned to glue by relentless rains. But the Aztecs adapted with chilling efficiency. They recruited Otomi mercenaries, borderland warriors who knew the terrain, to guide their columns, paying them not in gold but in captured Huastec slaves. Scouts marked safe routes with piles of white stones, a trick learned from the nomadic Chichimecs, and when hunger threatened mutiny, Ahuitzotl ordered his troops to feast on the very landscape, boiling unfamiliar palms and hunting peccaries with traps modeled after local designs. The Huastecs themselves were unlike any foes the Aztecs had faced. Their fighters smeared themselves in indigo dye, their teeth filed to points, their battle cries rising in eerie waves meant to mimic the shrieks of demons. They wielded weapons of deception, pitfalls lined with fire-hardened stakes, venomous snakes hurled in woven baskets, even poisoned darts blown through hollow reeds. But the Aztecs countered with psychological warfare. Priests marched at the army's vanguard, bearing effigies of Huastec gods captured in previous skirmishes, a blatant insult to divine power. When they took prisoners, they didn't execute them ceremonially. They branded their faces with glyphs marking them as eternal slaves, then released them to spread terror among their people. Victory at the Huastec capital of Tuxpan came not with a climactic siege, but through a masterstroke of cultural manipulation. Ahuitzotl's spies discovered that the Huastec king, fearful of his own nobles, had secretly converted to the Aztec cult of Tlaloc. The emperor sent envoys bearing gifts of jade and Quetzal feathers, not to the king's court, but to his rival chieftains, along with whispers that their ruler had already betrayed them. By the time Aztec armies arrived at the city gates, Tuxpan was in flames, set by its own divided people. The aftermath revealed the true cost of this northern gamble. While the Huasteca was nominally conquered, its people never fully assimilated. Their bolgaimes, their mushroom rituals, their reverence for the moon goddess Ixchel, all persisted beneath a thin veneer of Aztec rule. The empire's grip here would always be fragile, maintained not by shared faith or mutual benefit, but by the naked threat of reprisal. And in that tension lay a warning: an empire that expanded faster than it could integrate would one day find its edges fraying, its borders bleeding, until even the slightest pressure could make the whole tapestry unravel. For decades, the Flower Wars had been a deadly but controlled ritual, a sacred game where the Aztecs and Tlaxcalans agreed on the rules. But in 1499, the game turned vicious. What began as another ceremonial clash on the plains of Tlaxcala spiraled into something darker when Tlaxcala, tired of serving as the Aztec sacrificial quarry, decided to rewrite the script. Their warriors didn't just capture opponents for the altars this time. They slaughtered entire battalions, leaving the fields strewn with bodies stripped of their ceremonial finery. The message was clear: Tlaxcala would no longer play the role of willing prey. The Aztecs reeled from the defeat, not just because of the lost soldiers, but because the very logic of their warfare had been upended. Emperor Ahuitzotl responded with reforms that would reshape their military forever. Gone were the days of relying solely on obsidian-studded macuahuitl clubs. Armorers experimented with laminated cotton gambesons thickened with saline brine, a defense against Tlaxcala's newly adopted copper axes. Scouts trained hawks to carry tiny clay whistles, their shrill cries mimicking Tlaxcalan signals to sow confusion. Most crucially, the Aztecs abandoned their tradition of announcing battle dates in advance, adopting the Tlaxcalans' own tactics of dawn raids and ambushes. Yet the most chilling innovation lay in psychological warfare. After capturing a Tlaxcalan general, Ahuitzotl didn't send him to the temple. He had him paraded through allied cities with his eyelids stitched open, forced to witness the empire's strength before being released as a living warning. The Flower Wars had taught Tlaxcala how to fight. Now the Aztecs would teach them the price of defiance. This shift from ritual to total war marked a turning point. The battles of 1499 shattered the delicate balance that had sustained the Flower Wars for generations, proving that even the most sacred traditions could crumble when survival was at stake. And as the bloodshed escalated, an unspoken truth became inevitable. One day, this feud would demand a final reckoning. When it came, neither side could imagine the stranger who would arrive to tip the scales. Moctezuma II had barely settled onto the Jaguar throne when the empire struck back, not with an external enemy, but from within. In 1502, the Zapotec lords of Tehuantepec, long chafing under Aztec rule, saw their chance in the transition of power. They didn't just rebel, they orchestrated a masterstroke of defiance, poisoning tribute shipments bound for Tenochtitlan and slaughtering Aztec tax collectors, leaving their bodies draped in the very cotton mantles they'd come to collect. This wasn't mere disobedience, it was a calculated challenge to the new emperor's authority, one that would force Moctezuma to prove himself not just as a ruler but as a strategist. The rebellion exposed a flaw in the Aztec imperial machine: distance. Tehuantepec lay over 200 miles from the capital, a grueling march across jagged mountains and sweltering valleys. Supply lines stretched thin as the empire's reach exceeded its grasp, but Moctezuma responded with a tactic that blended brutality and cunning. Instead of sending a massive army, he dispatched small, elite units of Otomitl scouts, borderland warriors who moved like shadows, to destabilize the region ahead of the main force. They burned crops selectively, sparing villages that pledged loyalty, and spread rumors that the Zapotec leaders had stolen temple gold to fund their revolt. By the time Aztec battalions arrived, Tehuantepec was already fractured. Yet the true innovation came after the battlefield victory. Moctezuma installed his own sister as governor, a move unheard of in Aztec tradition, binding Tehuantepec to the throne through blood rather than fear. He allowed Zapotec nobility to keep their titles, but only if their sons were sent to Tenochtitlan as honored guests, effectively hostages raised as Aztec loyalists. The rebellion was crushed, but the cost lingered. The campaign drained coffers meant for grand construction projects, forcing Moctezuma to raise tributes elsewhere, sowing fresh resentment. And in the quiet corridors of power, the emperor learned a dangerous lesson. An empire that expanded too fast could choke on its own ambition. Tehuantepec became a cautionary tale written in smoke and shifting alliances. It proved that Aztec dominance wasn't invincible, just precariously balanced on the edge of a knife. Every conquered city was a potential spark, every distant province a future battleground. And as Moctezuma gazed at maps stretching from coast to coast, he must have wondered how many more fires awaited, and whether the next one would be the blaze that consumed them all. The jagged peaks of the Sierra Madre del Sur weren't just a landscape, they were a fortress of stone and mist where the Zapotec people had weathered invaders for centuries. When Aztec armies marched into these mountains in 1504, they weren't facing a conventional enemy. They were walking into a labyrinth of ambushes where every pass hid archers, every ravine concealed pitfalls, and even the rocks seemed to conspire against them. The Zapotecs didn't meet the empire in open battle. They dissolved into the terrain, striking like lightning and vanishing like smoke. What made this war unlike any other was the sheer asymmetry of tactics. Aztec commanders, accustomed to the disciplined formations of valley battles, now found their strategies useless. Heavy cotton armor became a death sentence on steep slopes, slowing warriors as they clambered over boulders. Supply trains, usually the empire's lifeline, were easy prey for Zapotec raiders who rolled boulders onto the narrow mountain trails, crushing porters and their cargo alike. In response, the Aztecs turned to innovations borrowed from their own past. They recruited Mixtec runners whose people had thrived in similar terrain to serve as mountain scouts. These lithe messengers could cover 40 miles in a day, relaying troop movements between fragmented units, yet the Zapotecs had their own brutal genius. They weaponized the very environment, diverting mountain springs to flood Aztec camps, then attacking in the chaos, their most devastating trick poison. Archers dipped their arrows in fermented venom from local tree frogs, causing wounds that festered even when the strikes weren't fatal. The Aztecs, in turn, adapted by carrying clay pellets filled with hallucinogenic mushrooms, tossing them into enemy positions to induce visions of demonic attackers, exploiting the Zapotecs' deep spiritual dread of altered states. After 18 months of grinding conflict, the Aztecs claimed victory, but at a cost that redefined their empire's limits. Instead of annexing the Zapotec lands outright, they settled for a grudging truce. The mountain cities would pay tribute, but their rulers remained in place. It was a stark admission. Some territories couldn't be held by force alone. The lesson etched itself into Aztec strategy forever after. There were places where even the mightiest empire's reach ended, where the land itself became a warrior no army could conquer. And in those unconquered peaks, the embers of resistance continued to smolder, waiting for the day they'd flare anew. By 1507, the Tlaxcalans had become more than just a nuisance to the Aztec Empire. They were an open wound festering at its very heart. Surrounded on all sides by Aztec-controlled territories, this defiant confederation of city-states should have crumbled decades earlier. Yet through sheer grit, cunning, and a refusal to bend, Tlaxcala had turned itself into an unconquerable fortress. And now, Emperor Moctezuma II was determined to finish what his predecessors had failed to do. This wasn't just another flower war skirmish. It was a full-scale invasion, the largest military campaign the Aztecs had ever launched against Tlaxcala. 20,000 warriors marched under the emperor's banner, backed by siege engines and elite Cuauhtémoc shock troops veterans who shaved their heads to display battle scars. The plan was simple: attack from 3 directions at once, cutting off Tlaxcala's food supply while overwhelming its defenses. But from the moment the army crossed the border, nothing went as planned. First came the terrain. Tlaxcalan spies had spent years preparing their homeland as a death-trap, narrow mountain passes lined with hidden pits, fields set ablaze to obscure troop movements, even poisoned waterholes marked with false signs of safety. Then came the Tlaxcalan tactics. Instead of meeting the Aztecs in pitched battles, they waged a war of attrition, striking supply caravans and melting into the hills. Their warriors carried lighter armor, allowing them to outmaneuver the heavily laden Aztec forces, and they used copper-edged macuahuitl that could splinter the obsidian blades of their enemies. But the Aztecs' greatest miscalculation was political. Moctezuma had assumed Tlaxcala's four ruling lords Xicotencatl, Maxixcatzin, Tlahuxolotzin, and Citlalpopoca would fracture under pressure. Instead, the invasion forged them into an unbreakable alliance. When Aztec diplomats tried bribing Xicotencatl with promises of autonomy, the Tlaxcalan lords sent back the gold melted into bullets for their slings. And when Moctezuma's spies spread rumors that the gods had abandoned Tlaxcala, the city's priests staged public visions showing Huitzilopochtli himself weeping over Tenochtitlan's future. After 6 months of brutal fighting, the Aztecs withdrew not in a single decisive defeat, but in a slow unraveling. Supply lines stretched too thin. Morale plummeted as Tlaxcalan raiders taunted the invaders with captured banners. Most damning of all, Moctezuma had underestimated the sheer resilience of a people fighting for survival. Tlaxcala wasn't just defending its land, it was defending its very identity, and that made every warrior, farmer, and child a soldier. The retreat became a turning point in Mesoamerican history. Instead of crushing their oldest rivals, the Aztecs had inadvertently hardened them into a battle-tested war machine, one that would remember every lesson learned when a new enemy arrived 12 years later. The Spanish conquistadors didn't just find Tlaxcala intact. They found an ally already schooled in Aztec weaknesses, from their reliance on supply lines to their vulnerability in mountainous terrain. Moctezuma's failure to conquer Tlaxcala didn't just leave a rival at the empire's doorstep, it planted the seeds of the Aztecs' own destruction. And when the time came, Tlaxcala would ensure those seeds bore bitter fruit. West of the Aztec Empire lay a kingdom even the most battle-hardened warriors spoke of in hushed tones, a land of obsidian mines and copper smiths, where armies fought beneath banners adorned with hummingbirds and arrows. The Tarascan Empire, known to its Purepecha people as the Arechiqua, wasn't just another rival, it was the one civilization the Aztecs could never break. By 1510, decades of sporadic skirmishes along their shared border had erupted into a full-scale war, pitting two military philosophies against each other in a clash that would redefine the limits of Mesoamerican warfare. The Aztecs marched west expecting another conquest, but what they found was a nightmare. Where Aztec warriors relied on the razor-sharp macuahuitl, the Tarascans wielded something far deadlier, copper. Their smiths had perfected metallurgy to a degree unseen elsewhere in Mesoamerica, forging axes that could splinter obsidian blades and helmets that turned aside arrows. Even more terrifying were their innovations in battlefield communication, signal mirrors polished to flash orders across miles, and drummers who used coded rhythms to coordinate ambushes. The Aztecs, masters of psychological warfare, now faced an enemy who outmaneuvered them with cold, calculated precision. Geography became the Tarascans' greatest ally. While the Aztecs dominated lake and valley, the Purepecha held the high-ground volcanic highlands dotted with fortified strongholds. Watchtowers carved into cliffs gave them early warning of troop movements, and their engineers had transformed entire mountainsides into killing zones. When Aztec scouts reported seeing Tarascan warriors walking on water, it wasn't magic. They'd stumbled upon suspension bridges woven from megi fibers, nearly invisible until you were upon them. Crossing these under arrow fire was suicide. The turning point came at the Battle of Tlaxcala, where the Aztecs learned the true cost of underestimating their Western rivals. Lured into a canyon by a feigned retreat, their vanguard found itself trapped between sheer rock walls as Tarascan slingers rained down not stones but beehives. Panicked soldiers, blinded by swarming insects, were cut down by copper-wielding shock troops who moved in perfect silence. The survivors brought back more than just wounds. They carried tales of a foe who didn't just resist the Aztec way of war but inverted it. Where the Aztecs prized loud, chaotic charges to instill terror, The Tarascans fought with eerie discipline, their attacks as measured as a priest counting sacrificial days. Moctezuma II faced a bitter realization after Tlaxcala. The Tarascans couldn't be intimidated, outmaneuvered, or starved into submission. Their empire was a mirrored version of his own, equally centralized, equally ruthless, and crucially, equally convinced of divine favor. The Aztecs withdrew, constructing a network of border fortresses that stood as silent admission. Some frontiers couldn't be crossed, but this stalemate held a darker truth. The Purepecha's unbroken resistance proved that the Aztec Empire wasn't invincible, just unchecked. And in that revelation lay the spark Tlaxcala and others would later fan into flames. Perhaps the greatest irony was that both empires fell within years of each other, not to one another, but to a shared enemy they never saw coming. The Tarascans' copper weapons and signal mirrors, so effective against the Aztecs, meant nothing against Spanish firearms. Their unconquered lands, like Tlaxcala's, became staging grounds for conquest. The border that had held for generations crumbled not under obsidian or copper, but under the weight of history's relentless turn. The Gulf Coast had never been quiet. Its people were too proud, its cities too rich, its memory of independence too sharp. But in 1512, what had been simmering resentment boiled over into outright rebellion. The Aztecs had ruled these lands for decades through a simple calculus, terror, and trade. Cities that paid tribute flourished, those that resisted were made examples of in ways so gruesome even their grandchildren would whisper about them. Yet this time the terror failed. The burning of a single defiant village, Tlaxcala, unleashed a firestorm the empire couldn't control. The spark came when Aztec tax collectors, armed with their usual threats, demanded not just the customary bales of cotton and jars of amber, but something far more precious, Tlaxcala's children. Selected for sacrifice ahead of an impending solar eclipse, the quota was higher than ever. When the village elders refused, the Aztec garrison responded with predictable brutality. Homes burned, leaders flayed alive, the sacred ceiba tree in the central plaza hacked down. But instead of cowing the region, the atrocity united it. The Totonacs, who had bickered among themselves for generations, now found common cause. Fishermen became messengers, paddling their canoes from town to town under cover of darkness. Market traders hid coded rebel plans in bundles of vanilla pods. Even the Aztecs' own allied governors secretly sent weapons, their loyalty frayed by years of ever-increasing tribute demand. What made this revolt different was its coordination. Previous uprisings had been isolated, easily crushed by quick military response. This time, the Gulf Coast rose as one. Aztec garrisons woke to find their water sources poisoned with bitter manioc. Supply barges vanished mid-river, their crews later found bound to trees with ropes of woven orchid stems. A deliberate humiliation, since orchids symbolized fragility to the Aztecs. Most devastating of all, the rebels avoided direct confrontation. They knew the empire's strength lay in set peace battles, so they waged a war of shadows. Roads became death traps lined with punji sticks smeared with stingray venom. Armories burned under mysterious circumstances, and when Aztec troops marched to relieve a besieged fort, they found it abandoned, its walls daubed with mocking murals of Moctezuma's face crossed out in indigo dye. The empire's response revealed its growing desperation. Moctezuma dispatched not just soldiers, but artisan stone carvers to deface rebel monuments, poets to compose victory songs in advance, even architects to sketch the grand new temples that would replace the ones they planned to burn. This was psychological warfare at its most blatant, an attempt to rewrite reality before the battle even ended, but the Gulf Coast refused to play its assigned role. In Sempoala, the Totonacs turned the Aztecs' own tactics against them, capturing a battalion commander and stitching his lips shut with agave thread before releasing him, a visceral reminder that their voices could no longer be silenced. By the time the rebellion was nominally suppressed 2 years later, the victory rang hollow. The Aztecs had spent blood and treasure to regain control of a region now stripped of its wealth. Vanilla groves lay untended, cotton fields burned to ash. Worse, the illusion of invincibility had shattered. Across the empire, subject peoples watched and learned the Aztecs could be bled. Moctezuma's governors imposed harsher punishments, but the cracks in the imperial edifice were widening. When the next challenge came, not from within, but from pale strangers arriving on winged boats, the Gulf Coast would remember its hard-won lesson. Empires built on fear alone burn brightest just before they go dark. The sweltering lowlands of Tabasco were a world away from the ordered majesty of Tenochtitlan, a tangled realm of mangroves and mosquitoes where the rivers ran thick with silt and the air clung to the skin like a second layer of armor. When Aztec armies marched south in 1515, they weren't just entering enemy territory, they were stepping into a cultural collision centuries in the making. The Maya city-states of the region, though long past the height of their classical glory, still fought with the tactical brilliance that had once made their ancestors the masters of Mesoamerica. This wouldn't be a simple war of conquest, it would become a laboratory of military innovation, where obsidian met jade and two warrior traditions clashed, adapted, and ultimately transformed each other. From the outset, the campaign defied Aztec expectations. Where they were accustomed to sweeping valley battles, the Maya favored ambushes from river canoes, their archers firing arrows tipped with fermented snake venom before melting back into the labyrinth of waterways. The dense jungle neutralized the Aztecs' numerical advantage, forcing them to fight in small, fragmented units. But necessity bred ingenuity. Aztec commanders began adopting Maya tactics, using captured canoes to navigate the Usumacinta River and recruiting local Chontal guides who knew the hidden paths between mangrove islands. In a stroke of psychological warfare, they even repurposed Mayan glyphs, carving false prophecies onto abandoned stelae to demoralize enemy troops, a tactic borrowed from the Mayas' own tradition of sacred warfare. The Maya, in turn, learned from their invaders. They'd never faced an army that fought with the Aztecs' sheer ferocity in close combat, where the Macuahuitl could decapitate a man in a single swing. Soon, Mayan smiths were reforging captured Aztec obsidian into their own versions of the weapon, while their strategists studied the invaders' siege techniques. The most startling exchange came in the realm of medicine. Aztec healers, amazed by the Mayas' use of hallucinogenic fungi to treat battle trauma, began incorporating the practice, while Maya physicians adopted the Aztec art of stitching wounds with human hair, far superior to their traditional plant fiber sutures. Yet the campaign's most lasting impact was cultural. The Aztecs, accustomed to viewing all non-Nahua peoples as barbarians, found themselves awestruck by Mayan astronomy and mathematics. Captive Mayan scribes were brought back to Tenochtitlan not as slaves, but as scholars, teaching Aztec priests to predict eclipses with precision that rivaled their own calendrical mastery. Meanwhile, Maya artists began depicting Aztec warriors in their murals not as monsters, but as worthy adversaries, their feathered regalia rendered with meticulous detail. This mutual respect born on the battlefield hinted at a tantalizing possibility. An alternate future where two great civilizations might have forged not just an alliance but a shared legacy. But history had other plans. The Tabasco campaign ended in a fragile stalemate. The Aztecs claimed nominal control, but the Maya retained much of their autonomy. As the invaders withdrew, they left behind more than just outposts, they left ideas. The Maya would never again fight exactly as they had before, and the Aztecs carried home tactics that would later shape their doomed defense against the Spanish. Perhaps the greatest irony of this forgotten conflict is that the very innovations exchanged here, Mayan guerrilla tactics blended with Aztec shock warfare, would one day be turned against both peoples by a common enemy. The echoes of Tabasco's clashes rippled far beyond the mangroves, proving that even in war, no culture fights in isolation. The drums that echoed across the plains of Tlaxcala in 1517 didn't just signal another flower war, they marked the end of an era. By this time, the sacred ritual battles between the Aztecs and Tlaxcalans had long since shed their ceremonial purity. What began as a divine contract to feed the gods had twisted into something far darker, a brutal hybrid of ritual and realpolitik, where the line between sacred capture and outright conquest blurred beyond recognition. The Aztecs, sensing the shifting tides of fortune, no longer fought merely to take prisoners for the altars. They fought to break Tlaxcala once and for all. Emperor Moctezuma II, ever the pragmatist beneath his priestly robes, saw these flower wars for what they had become, a slow-motion siege. His generals adopted tactics that would have shocked their ancestors. Instead of announcing battle dates, they launched surprise attacks at harvest time, knowing starvation could achieve what obsidian swords had not. They targeted not just warriors but farmland, burning maize fields that had fed Tlaxcala for generations. Even the act of prisoner-taking grew more sinister. Captives were no longer primarily destined for the temples, but for slave markets, their labor fueling the Aztec war machine. Yet Tlaxcala refused to play by the new rules. Their warriors, hardened by a century of intermittent combat, met Aztec innovations with their own. They began disguising elite fighters as sacrificial victims, their bodies smeared with fake blood, only to rise up mid-ritual and slaughter unsuspecting Aztec priests. One particularly audacious raid saw Tlaxcalan commandos infiltrate an Aztec camp by posing as traders, their baskets of chilies hiding not goods but weapons. The flower war had become a chess game where every sacred tradition concealed a dagger. Archaeologists examining the Tlaxcala battlefield years later found evidence of this grim evolution. Among the usual ritual blades and feather adornments lay artifacts that told a different story: makeshift fortifications, mass graves with bound skeletons, proof of executions, not ceremonial sacrifices, and, most tellingly, copper arrowheads traded from the unconquered Tarascan lands. These weren't the tools of a sacred contest, but of a people fighting for survival against an empire that had abandoned the old covenants. The aftermath revealed the tragic irony of this final flower war. In their desperation to crush Tlaxcala, the Aztecs had unwittingly forged their most dangerous enemy. Tlaxcalan warriors, tempered in these brutal pseudo-rituals, emerged with intimate knowledge of Aztec tactics. Knowledge they would soon share with strange new allies. Within 2 years, bearded men in metal armor would land on the Gulf Coast, and the very battlefields where gods had once been fed with blood would become training grounds for an invasion. The last flower war didn't just foreshadow the fall of the Aztec Empire, it handed the invaders their most lethal weapon, a people who knew exactly how to break the jewel of Anahuac. The first Spanish ship wasn't spotted by Aztec scouts, it was smelled. In April 1519, fishermen near Tlaxcala reported a strange stench on the wind, like rotting meat and metal, before anyone even saw the towering sails cresting the horizon. By the time Moctezuma's spies reached the coast, Hernán Cortés and his 400 conquistadors had already landed, their pale skins glistening with sweat under alien armor, their snorting horses terrifying villagers who'd never seen beasts taller than deer. What followed weren't just battles, they were seismic culture shocks, moments where two worlds colluded and clashed with weapons ripped from each other's nightmares. The initial skirmish at Potonchan revealed a horrifying truth to the Aztecs. These strangers fought like nothing they'd ever faced. Spanish steel swords sliced through cotton armor as if it were paper. Cannons roared like jaguars made of thunder, their iron balls shattering stone walls in explosions of dust and screams. But most terrifying of all were the horses, creatures the Aztecs first believed to be some monstrous fusion of deer and man, their hooves trampling warriors who'd been trained to fight foot to foot, not against charging nightmares. One Nahua account described the chaos. They came upon us like walking towers, their bodies shining like water under the sun. killing with sticks that spat fire and stank of burnt lightning. Yet the Aztecs adapted with chilling speed. After capturing a fallen conquistador's helmet, their armorers experimented with laminating cotton in layers of brine-soaked fabric, creating gambesons thick enough to occasionally deflect rapier thrusts. Scouts quickly noted that the Spanish guns took agonizingly long to reload perfect windows for ambushes. Most crucially, they realized these pale invaders bled like any other men. When Aztec warriors finally dragged a Spaniard down from his horse at Cintla and tore open his breastplate with obsidian blades, the psychological spell was broken. The message spread like wildfire. Tetio gods didn't scream when stabbed. Moctezuma's response was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. Instead of massing his armies for a direct assault, he sent envoys bearing gifts that calculatedly blurred the line between reverence and threat. Gold to inflame Spanish greed, but also jaguar pelts and quetzal feathers, objects representing Aztec military might. His spies noted every Spanish reaction, from their marveling at Tenochtitlan's scale to their shuddering disgust at sacrificial altars. This wasn't just observation, it was cold behavioral study, an empire dissecting its predator. By the time Cortés reached the gates of Tenochtitlan, both sides had already rewritten their playbooks. The Spanish, initially dismissive of savage tactics, now copied Aztec ambush strategies in the jungle. The Aztecs, meanwhile, had begun stockpiling captured steel weapons in secret armories, their smiths laboring to reverse engineer the alien metal. Neither could have imagined that their deadly dance was just the opening movement, and that the real battle wouldn't be fought with swords or cannons, but with something far more contagious: disease, betrayal, and the slow unraveling of an empire's soul. Collula was no ordinary city. It was the sacred heart of Mesoamerica, a place where pilgrims walked barefoot for miles to worship at the ancient pyramid of Quetzalcoatl. When Cortés arrived in October 1519 with his ragged band of conquistadors and their new Tlaxcalan allies, they were met not with drawn swords but with open gates and flower-strewn streets. The city's rulers offered lavish gifts: golden ornaments, embroidered cloaks, baskets of ripe fruit, all while whispering urgent warnings in the Spaniards' ears. The Tlaxcalans, they claimed, were treacherous savages. The Aztecs, they insisted, were preparing an ambush. Every smiling face hid a knife. Every gesture of friendship reeked of deceit. What happened next remains one of history's most hotly debated turning points. After 3 tense days of feasting and veiled threats, Cortés ordered his men to strike first. The massacre that followed wasn't a battle, it was slaughter. Spanish arquebuses roared in the temple courtyard as armored soldiers hacked down unarmed nobles. Tlaxcalan warriors, seething from generations of flower war humiliations, ran wild through the streets, setting fire to palaces and dragging priests from their altars. By sundown, between 3,000 and 6,000 Colulans lay dead, their bodies piled in the sacred plaza like offerings to some forgotten god. The Spanish would later claim they'd uncovered an Aztec plot: stashes of hidden weapons, secret tunnels under the city. The surviving Colulans told a different story. A paranoid foreigner fed lies by his Tlaxcalan puppets, turning a holy city into a charnel house. The strategic impact was immediate and contradictory. On one hand, the massacre sent shockwaves through the Valley of Mexico. City-states that might have resisted the Spanish now scrambled to pledge allegiance, terrified of becoming the next Collula. But the brutality also hardened Aztec resolve. Moctezuma's spies spread word of the atrocity, painting the invaders as mad dogs who violated every rule of civilized warfare. Even Cortés' own men grew uneasy. One conquistador's journal admits they'd been fed scant proof of any conspiracy, murmuring that their leader had struck like a cornered viper, not a Christian knight. Archaeology adds chilling layers to the debate. Excavations beneath Collula's main plaza reveal hastily dug mass graves, their skeletons bearing wounds from both steel blades and obsidian clubs. proof the Tlaxcalans participated eagerly. Yet no cache of Aztec weapons has ever been found, just the usual ceremonial daggers stored in every temple. Perhaps most telling are the glyphs carved years later by surviving Colulan artists. They depict Cortés not as a conqueror, but as a puppet dangling from Tlaxcalan strings, his face twisted in idiot rage. Was it strategic genius or catastrophic blunder? The answer lies in the aftermath. The massacre brought Cortés temporary fear where diplomacy might have built lasting alliances. When the Aztecs later besieged the Spanish in Tenochtitlan, not a single Colulan lifted a finger to help their liberators. The chilling lesson echoed far beyond Mesoamerica. Terror can win battles, but it rarely wins wars. And sometimes the bloodiest preemptive strikes plant the seeds of their own undoing. The canals of Tenochtitlan had never carried a stranger cargo than the one that glided through them in November 1519. Spanish brigantines, their sails incongruous against the backdrop of floating gardens, their decks crowded with men who smelled of salt and metal. Hernán Cortés stood at the prow, his gaze sweeping across a city that defied comprehension. 50,000 buildings, towering temples that caught the dawn, causeways thronged with curious onlookers. This wasn't just an arrival, it was the collision of two universes, each armed with weapons the other couldn't fully comprehend. Moctezuma's decision to welcome the invaders rather than crush them at the gates has puzzled historians for centuries. Was it strategic genius, a ploy to lure the Spanish into a controlled environment where their every move could be monitored? Or was it paralyzing dread, the emperor trapped between prophecies of Quetzalcoatl's return and the cold calculus of military reality? The truth likely lay somewhere in between. Aztec scouts had seen the Spaniards' guns reduce walls to rubble at Tlaxcala. Their spies reported how these strangers moved, not as a horde, but with disciplined formations that suggested deeper tactical knowledge than any nomadic raiders. By inviting them into the city, Moctezuma may have been playing the long game, studying their weaknesses, testing their intentions, buying time to rally his far-flung armies. The diplomatic dance that followed was a masterpiece of double meanings. When Moctezuma presented Cortés with the golden Xutlapili, the ceremonial girdle of office, was it an act of submission or a clever ruse to see if the Spaniard would recognize it as a symbol of temporary stewardship rather than kingship? The gifts exchanged in those first days spoke in layered tongues. Jade masks that whispered of ancestral power, cotton armor dyed with cochineal to resemble flayed skin, a not-so-subtle reminder of Aztec martial traditions. Cortés, for his part, played his role with equal cunning, presenting steel mirrors that reflected not just faces, but the emperor's own uncertainty staring back. Yet beneath the pageantry, Tenochtitlan was fortifying itself in ways the Spanish couldn't perceive. Engineers quietly altered the mechanisms of movable bridges along the causeways, ensuring they could isolate sections of the city at will. Poison-tipped darts were stockpiled in temple armories, their recipes borrowed from Mayan captives. Most tellingly, Moctezuma ordered the imperial zoo emptied not just of jaguars and eagles, but of the human specimens kept in its darker corners, albinos, dwarves, and foreigners from every conquered land. These living curiosities were now hidden from Spanish eyes, lest they reveal the empire's vast geographic knowledge. Every courtesy extended to Cortés came with an invisible countermove. The fatal miscalculation wasn't Moctezuma's hospitality, but his misreading of Spanish psychology. To the Aztecs, warfare had rules, even the flower wars followed sacred protocols. But Cortés fought with a different code. When he saw Tenochtitlan's wealth, he didn't see a culture to admire, he saw vaults to plunder. When Moctezuma spoke of divine cycles and the shared governance of the world, the conquistador heard only hesitation. The emperor had hoped to contain the threat by bringing it into his house. Instead, he'd let the wolf pass the gate and its jaws were already opening. The festival of Tlaxcala should have been a celebration of renewal, a sacred dance to honor Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, as the rainy season breathed life back into the valley. Instead, the temple courtyards of Tenochtitlan became a slaughterhouse. In May 1520, while Cortés was away dealing with a rival Spanish force, his lieutenant Pedro de Alvarado stood watching as Aztec nobles gathered in their finest feather headdresses and jade ornaments, unaware that the rules of war were about to be rewritten in blood. Alvarado had grown paranoid. The sight of thousands of unarmed aristocrats moving in synchronized ritual, their limbs painted with sacred ochre, their chants rising like a single voice, struck him not as devotion but as the prelude to an uprising. Without waiting for proof, he ordered the gates barred. Spanish arquebusiers took positions on the temple steps. Then the massacre began. Steel swords hacked through swirling clouds of copal incense. Cavalry trampled dancers mid-step. By the time the plaza ran red, between 5,000 and 10,000 lay dead, not warriors but priests, poets, and the very elites who had welcomed the Spaniards as curiosities months earlier. The psychological impact was immediate and irreversible. Where Moctezuma's capture had confused the Aztecs, the Tlaxcala massacre ignited them. Survivors spoke of Spanish soldiers prying jade from dying men's teeth before they'd finished choking on their own blood, a sacrilege that transformed Cortés' men from strange guests into something far worse than enemies. They became Tlaxcala, owl demons who defiled the sacred order. The empire's fractured factions now united under a single purpose. Even Moctezuma, long hesitant, could no longer straddle both worlds. When he was dragged onto a rooftop to plead for calm, his own people pelted him with stones, a king made irrelevant by the very violence he'd failed to prevent. Archaeologists sifting through the site centuries later found eerie proof of the massacre's spontaneity. Unlike ritual sacrifices with clean bone cuts, these remains showed the chaotic brutality of panic, skulls crushed by mace blows, vertebrae severed at wild angles. Most telling were the artifacts left behind: smashed flutes still clutched in skeletal hands, feathered regalia trampled into the mud. This wasn't battle, it was the desecration of a culture's heartbeat. The Tlaxcala massacre didn't just harden Aztec resolve, it revealed the fatal flaw in Spanish strategy. Cortés had relied on a delicate balance of terror and diplomacy, but Alvarado's rashness tipped the scales irrevocably. Within days, Tenochtitlan became a city of barricades and burning causeways. The same nobles who had once marveled at Spanish mirrors now led charges with obsidian clubs. And when the rains came that summer, they washed not just blood from the stones, but any last pretense that two civilizations could share the same world. The war was no longer about gold or gods, it was about survival, and the Aztecs finally had nothing left to lose. The night of June 30th, 1520 was anything but silent. Under the cover of a pounding summer storm, Cortés and his surviving conquistadors moved like ghosts through Tenochtitlan's waterlogged streets, their armor muffled with stolen cloth, their boots slipping on stones slick with rain and blood. They had one desperate goal: escape the city alive. What followed wasn't a retreat, it was a massacre in reverse, a moment when the Aztecs came within a hair's breadth of erasing the Spanish threat forever. For weeks, the Aztecs had tightened their noose. With Moctezuma dead, whether by Spanish hands or his own people's stones, no one could say. The new emperor Cuitlahuac unleashed a fury the invaders had never anticipated. Causeways were dismantled, canoes ambushed supply lines, and the very canals seemed to turn against the Spaniards. As the refugees reached the Tacuba Causeway, they found it not just broken but booby-trapped. Aztec engineers had removed key sections, replacing them with flimsy wooden bridges that groaned under the weight of armored men. When the first Spanish horsemen crossed, the beams gave way, sending men and animals plunging into the lake, where waiting canoes descended like piranhas on wounded prey. The Aztecs didn't just fight that night, they orchestrated. Drummers hidden on rooftops used coded rhythms to coordinate attacks from all sides. archers fired not to kill but to wound, knowing injured Spaniards would slow their comrades. Women on balconies hurled pottery filled with blinding lime powder, while divers swam beneath the surface to drag down stragglers. One Nahuatl account describes a Spaniard screaming as warriors methodically peeled off his armor, like the shell of a turtle, before taking his heart. Yet in their moment of triumph, the Aztecs made one fatal miscalculation. Believing the Spanish were finished, they prioritized capturing prisoners for sacrifice over total annihilation. This wasn't just arrogance, it was cultural reflex. To the Aztecs, a live enemy was far more valuable than a dead one. Their gods demanded beating hearts, not corpses. So when Cortés and his core survivors broke free into the marshlands, they left behind not just gold and guns, but something far more dangerous, a lesson. The Spanish called it La Noche Triste, the sad night, but the real tragedy belonged to the Aztecs. They'd proven they could outthink, outmaneuver, and humiliate the invaders. Yet by letting the wounded wolf limp away, they'd given Cortés exactly what he needed most, a second chance. And this time he wouldn't come bearing gifts or hollow promises. He'd return with fire, steel, and the grim certainty that only one civilization would walk away from this war. The siege of Tenochtitlan in 1521 wasn't just a battle. It was the slow, methodical dismantling of a civilization. After the disaster of La Noche Triste, Cortés spent a year weaving a noose around the Aztec capital. He didn't just rebuild his army, he transformed it. Spanish survivors, reinforced by fresh troops from Cuba, now fought alongside 10,000 Tlaxcalan warriors, men who knew every weakness in Tenochtitlan's defenses. But the real weapon wasn't steel or numbers, it was invisible. Smallpox, carried unwittingly by a single infected slave, had already burned through the city, killing Emperor Cuitlahuac and countless others. The Aztecs called it Huey Coccolistli, the Great Pestilence, and its timing couldn't have been more catastrophic. Cortés' first move was to strangle the city's lifelines. Engineers constructed 13 brigantines, wooden warships armed with cannons, to dominate Lake Texcoco. These floating fortresses severed supply routes, sinking canoes laden with food and reinforcements. Meanwhile, indigenous allies who'd once feared the Aztecs now saw their chance for vengeance. Texcocans, Chalca, even former vassals of Moctezuma rallied to the Spanish banner, not out of loyalty to Cortés, but to finally break the empire that had bled them dry for generations. Inside the city, Cuauhtémoc, the young, defiant new emperor, faced impossible odds. His people were starving, their granaries emptied by Spanish raids. The aqueducts that once carried fresh water from Chapultepec lay in ruins, shattered by cannon fire. Yet the Aztecs fought with a desperate ingenuity. They dug pits along causeways to trap horses, wove underwater barriers of sharpened stakes to gut Spanish boats, and even launched nighttime raids using decoy fires to lure enemies into ambushes. One Spanish chronicle describes warriors disguising themselves as fallen conquistadors, slipping into enemy camps to slit throats before melting back into the darkness. The final assault came in 3 brutal waves. First, Spanish forces captured key districts house by house, filling canals with rubble to create makeshift roads. Then came the Chinampa strategy, burning the floating gardens that fed the city, turning paradise into charred wasteland. Finally, the siege tightened like a vice. Aztec defenders, reduced to eating lizards and tree bark, made their last stand in the Tlatelolco market district. When the end came, it wasn't with a climactic duel, but with the slow realization that every street, every temple, every scrap of hope had been consumed. Cuauhtémoc's capture marked more than just a military defeat. It was the death knell of a worldview. As Spanish soldiers tore down pyramids to build churches, as smallpox ravaged survivors staggered through rubble that had once been the Venice of the Americas, the true cost of conquest became clear. The siege hadn't just toppled a city, it had shattered the cosmological order that held the Aztec universe together. And in its place rose a new world, built on ashes and alliances no one could have predicted a few short years before. The shallow waters of Lake Texcoco had always been the Aztecs' greatest shield, a natural moat that turned their island capital into an impenetrable fortress. But in 1521, those same waters became their downfall, as 13 Spanish brigantines sliced through the lake like knives through silk. These weren't just boats, they were floating fortresses, each painstakingly constructed from dismantled ships hauled over mountains by indigenous allies and reassembled on the lakeshore under the watchful eye of Cortés' master shipwright Martin Lopez. With their high sides shielding against arrows, their swivel-mounted cannons sweeping the water, and their sails allowing movement even when Aztec divers tried to snarl their oars, these brigantines transformed the lake from a defensive asset into a killing field. The Aztec canoe fleets, once masters of these waters, found themselves outmatched at every turn. Their lightweight Acali canoes, designed for stealth and speed in the maze of Chinampa canals, were no match for the brigantines' firepower. Spanish accounts describe the horror of indigenous warriors watching cannonballs tear through entire formations of canoes, as if they were made of paper, while crossbowmen picked off paddlers from impossible distances. Yet the Aztecs adapted with desperate creativity. Night raids saw canoes loaded with burning pitch drifted toward the Spanish fleet. Divers weighted with stones crept along the lakebed to drill holes in hulls. One Nahuatl account tells of warriors disguising themselves as floating logs to ambush boarding parties, only for the Spanish to respond by tossing lit torches onto anything that looked suspicious. Controlling the lake wasn't just about sinking canoes, it was about choking Tenochtitlan's lifelines. Every Spanish brigantine became a mobile blockade, intercepting food shipments from Xochimilco, preventing freshwater deliveries from Chapultepec, and cutting off escape routes for reinforcements. Cortés' masterstroke came when he ordered his fleet to capture the causeway fortifications at night, using the boats as floating bridges to outflank Aztec barricades. The psychological impact was devastating. For generations, the Aztecs had believed their island home invincible. Now they watched in disbelief as these alien vessels turned their sacred waters into a highway for their enemies. The true tragedy lay in the lake itself. As the siege dragged on, Spanish bombardment and the destruction of aqueducts turned the crystalline waters brackish with runoff and corpses. The once teeming fish died off, the reeking shallows breeding disease. By the final days of the siege, Lake Texcoco, the shimmering heart of the Aztec world, had become a putrid mirror reflecting only smoldering ruins. The brigantines hadn't just won a battle, they'd drained the life from an empire as surely as if they'd pulled some cosmic plug. And when the last Aztec canoes were finally burned or sunk, it wasn't just a fleet that vanished, it was an entire way of understanding warfare, faith, and humanity's place between water and sky. Tlaxcala was never meant to fall. As Tenochtitlan's fierce twin city, its towering marketplaces and temples had stood unbroken for generations, a bustling hub where merchants from across Mesoamerica bartered under the watchful eyes of warriors. But by August 1521, its broad plazas ran red with more than just the dyes of exotic goods. This was where the Aztec Empire would make its final stand, where the last free warriors of Anahuac would prove that even in defeat, their courage could etch itself into history. The Spanish assault came like a storm breaking over the city. Brigantines prowled the canals, their cannons reducing adobe walls to dust, while Tlaxcalan allies swarmed through the rubble with fire-hardened spears. Yet Tlaxcala's defenders fought with the desperate brilliance of men who knew they were writing the last chapter of their world. They turned the marketplace itself into a deadly maze, overturning stalls to create ambush points, hurling jars of scalding chocolate at invaders, even releasing captive eagles to confuse Spanish horses. One Nahuatl account describes warriors camouflaging themselves among the dead, springing up to drag conquistadors into the canals when they passed too close. Young Emperor Cuauhtémoc, barely 20 but hardened by months of siege, organized a defense that blended ancient tactics with terrifying innovation. Priests used Aztec signaling mirrors to coordinate counterattacks from rooftops, while engineers built makeshift dams to flood streets and trap the Spanish in kill zones. Most haunting were the night whispers, children sent slipping between enemy lines to spread demoralizing rumors in perfect Spanish, a psychological warfare tactic learned from observing their captors. Yet starvation and smallpox had done their work. As the weeks wore on, defenders resorted to chewing leather shields for sustenance. The Spanish found pockets of resistance where warriors lay too weak to stand but still clutched obsidian blades in skeletal hands. When the final assault came, it wasn't steel that broke Tlatelolco's spirit but fire. Cortés ordered the marketplace torched, forcing survivors into the open where Spanish crossbows waited. Cuauhtémoc's capture marked more than the end of a battle. It was the death rattle of a cosmology. As the emperor was dragged before Cortés, legend claims he placed a dagger to his own chest and said, "I have done what was required of me for my city and my people. Now do what you must." In that moment, 5 centuries of Aztec sovereignty dissolved into smoke over the ruins of the greatest marketplace the Americas had ever known. Archaeologists would later uncover mass graves beneath Tlatelolco's plaza, not the orderly sacrifices of temple altars, but chaotic piles of men, women, and children who had fought to the last breath for a world that would exist only in memory. The fall of Tlatelolco didn't just end an empire, it revealed an uncomfortable truth about conquest. The Spanish won through disease and starvation as much as military might, while the Aztecs lost not from lack of courage, but because their entire civilization had been engineered for a different kind of warfare, one with rules the invaders refused to acknowledge. And in the ashes of that imbalance, a new world was born, carrying fragments of the old in its bones. The fall of Tenochtitlan didn't end the war, it scattered the fight into the mountains, where the last free Aztec warriors turned the land itself into a weapon. While Spanish banners flew over the smoldering ruins of the capital, pockets of resistance regrouped in the highlands, trading temple pyramids for guerrilla strongholds. Cuauhtémoc's capture had shattered the empire's spine, but its spirit refused to die. In the rugged terrain of the Sierra Madre, survivors who'd slipped through Spanish nets waged a new kind of war, one fought not with grand armies, but with shadows, patience, and intimate knowledge of the earth. These holdouts abandoned everything that had once defined Aztec warfare: the massed ranks, the glittering eagle warriors, the trumpet blast signaling battle. Instead, they fought like ghosts. Spanish patrols venturing into the mountains found roads blocked by landslides, their scouts vanishing without a sound. Waterholes turned deadly overnight, poisoned with crushed toxic mushrooms. Most chilling were the ambushes, attacks that came not from hidden foes but from the very rocks underfoot. Warriors camouflaged with mud and moss would lie motionless for days, waiting to strike at stragglers with obsidian-edged farming tools. One Spanish chronicler described finding a decapitated soldier with his own sword driven into the dirt beside him, a grim reminder that these savages had mastered their enemies' weapons faster than the invaders had grasped the land. Yet this resistance wasn't just brutality, it was cultural preservation. Hidden valleys became living museums of Aztec tradition. Scribes who'd escaped the burning libraries of Tenochtitlan composed new codices on deerskin, recording histories they feared might vanish. Priests performed clandestine rites in caves, their chants muffled by waterfalls. Even the old warrior schools, the Tlaxcala, reconvened in secret, teaching a stripped-down curriculum of survival, how to track Spanish armor by its creaks, which herbs dulled the pain of bullet wounds, where to melt stolen church silver into arrowheads. The Spanish response revealed their growing frustration. Cortés, accustomed to set peace battles, now faced an enemy that refused to stand still. His troops scorched villages only to find them repopulated weeks later. Captured guerrillas laughed under torture, reciting prophecies about the empire's eventual return. By early 1522, the campaign had devolved into a macabre game of cat and mouse, except the mice kept turning into scorpions. In one notorious incident, a Spanish column chasing rumors of Cuauhtémoc's hidden treasury was led deep into a box canyon where warriors rolled flaming logs from the cliffs above, igniting gunpowder stores in a chain reaction that lit up the night sky for miles. What finally broke the resistance wasn't military defeat, but the slow erosion of hope. As years passed without the prophesied uprising, as Spanish settlers carved up the highlands into encomiendas, the mountain strongholds dwindled. Some guerrillas melted into distant Maya territories. Others founded hidden mestizo villages where old gods were worshipped under Christian saint names. Their greatest legacy wasn't victories, it was proving that conquest is never truly complete. Long after the last obsidian blade was buried, the land remembered. Even today, Nahuatl-speaking communities in these mountains recount stories of ancestors who fought not for an empire, but for the right to remain themselves amidst the wreckage of worlds. The embers of resistance never truly died, not in the hearts of those who remembered Tenochtitlan's fall, not in the whispers of priests who still traced the old glyphs in the dirt. 2 decades after Cortés' victory, the flames erupted again in the jagged peaks of the Mixton, where the Caxcanes, Zacatecos, and descendants of Aztec warriors united in a rebellion that would force Spain to question its grip on New Spain. This wasn't just another revolt, it was a collision of worlds where the ghosts of Mesoamerican warfare clashed with the hardened reality of colonial rule. The rebellion's spark came from a cruelty so routine the Spanish barely noticed it. Encomenderos, greedy for silver and slaves, had pushed indigenous laborers beyond endurance, starving them, branding their faces like cattle, even ripping infants from mothers to sell in distant markets. But in 1541, the Caxcanes refused to break. Under the leadership of a visionary warrior named Tenochtitlan, they abandoned the mines and fled to the cliffs of Mixton, a fortress like Mesa where the terrain itself became their ally. Soon, thousands joined them, not just Caxcanes, but Nahua survivors of the Aztec collapse, Purepecha refugees, even African slaves who'd escaped Spanish haciendas. Together, they forged something unprecedented, a multi-ethnic alliance bound by shared fury. Their tactics were a chilling evolution of pre-Hispanic warfare. Gone were the massed formations of Tenochtitlan's glory days. These rebels fought like wraiths. Spanish accounts describe ambushes where attackers seemed to melt into the rocks, their bodies painted with ochre and ash for camouflage. Arrows tipped with the same snake venom that once felled Aztec enemies now dropped conquistadors in agonized convulsions. Most terrifying of all were the psychological strikes, rebels dressing in stolen Spanish armor to infiltrate camps, or leaving meticulously arranged corpses on roadsides, their mouths stuffed with silver coins as grotesque mockery of colonial greed. Yet the Spanish had evolved too. No longer the bewildered invaders of Cortés' era, they'd spent 20 years dissecting indigenous tactics. Viceroy Antonio de Mendoza responded with a brutal new strategy: systematic starvation. Crops were torched, water sources poisoned with salt, and any village suspected of aiding rebels was erased. When outright assault failed, Mendoza turned to darker weapons, using Aztec nobles who'd allied with Spain to infiltrate rebel ranks, their Nahuatl fluency a Trojan horse for betrayal. The final assault on Mixton Mesa combined overwhelming firepower with cold calculation. Spanish cannons pounded the heights while Tlaxcalan auxiliaries, once the Aztecs' mortal enemies, scaled cliffs under cover of smoke, their knowledge of indigenous warfare now weaponized against their own. The rebellion's collapse was as brutal as its rise. Survivors leaped from cliffs rather than face capture, their screams haunting the canyon walls. Tenochtitlan vanished into legend. Some said he fled north to stir up the Chichimca. Others claimed he walked into the sea, vowing to return. But Mixton's true legacy wasn't in its defeat. it was in the fractures it exposed. Spain, shaken by the cost of victory, began to question the encomienda system, planting seeds for future reforms. The rebels, though crushed, proved that the spirit of resistance couldn't be extinguished by swords or sermons. And in the shadows of New Spain's churches, where converts still whispered the old prayers, a truth lingered. Conquest was a story without end, written over and over in blood and defiance. The fall of Tenochtitlan didn't erase centuries of military tradition. It just forced them underground, where they simmered like embers beneath the surface of New Spain. The Spanish might have shattered the Aztec Empire, but they couldn't extinguish the warrior ethos that had shaped Mesoamerica for generations. In the shadows of colonial churches and haciendas, indigenous military societies adapted, evolving into something far more dangerous to Spanish rule, a hybrid resistance blending ancient tactics with the harsh realities of conquest. Take the Guachachayals, for example. These Nahua warriors, once the backbone of Aztec shock troops, now served as Indios amigos in Spanish militias, outwardly loyal, yet secretly preserving their ancestral combat techniques. Spanish viceroys praised their battlefield prowess, unaware these same fighters were teaching younger generations to wield obsidian-edged macuahuitl clubs in hidden jungle clearings. Even the Spanish reliance on indigenous auxiliaries backfired spectacularly. Tlaxcalan warriors, once Cortés' staunchest allies, later led rebellions using the very strategies they'd learned fighting alongside conquistadors, proving how quickly the student could become the teacher. The church unwittingly became an unlikely sanctuary for these traditions. Franciscan friars, eager to convert indigenous nobles, allowed certain warrior dances as harmless folk customs. But beneath the veneer of Christian piety, these performances were live combat drills. The Volador's ceremony, with its dizzying descents from towering poles, doubled as training for cliff assaults, while mock battles during feast days kept siege tactics alive. One Spanish inspector in 1583 complained that these festivities suspiciously resembled military exercises because they were. Most striking was how Aztec warfare reshaped colonial conflicts. When the Mixton Rebellion erupted in 1541, rebel Caxcanes used Aztec-style signal mirrors to coordinate attacks across mountain ranges, while their spies infiltrated Spanish camps by posing as penitent converts. Decades later, during the Chichimca War, indigenous archers employed the same poison-tipped arrows that had once stymied Aztec expansion. Even Spanish officers begrudgingly adopted native tactics, fielding lightweight cotton armor based on Aztec designs, lighter and more effective than European steel in the sweltering highlands. The ultimate irony, Spain's own empire building relied on the very systems it had tried to destroy. The repartimiento labor drafts mirrored Aztec tribute networks, while colonial militias organized along lines suspiciously similar to the old Calpulli warrior clans. By the 18th century, mestizo rebels like Jacinto Canek invoked the ghost of Cuauhtémoc in their uprisings, proving that while empires could be toppled, the memory of how to fight back never died. The Aztecs might have lost their capital, but their art of war became the silent curriculum of resistance, passed down in whispers, dances, and the blood-stained pages of history. The dirt beneath modern Mexico City holds more than just broken pottery and old bones. It cradles the echoes of ancient battles waiting to be heard again. For generations, historians relied on Spanish chronicles and indigenous codices to reconstruct Aztec warfare, but these accounts were often tangled with propaganda, myth, or simple misunderstanding. Now, archaeology is rewriting those narratives one trowel scrape at a time. Take the ruins of Tlatelolco, where in 1993 workers digging for a new parking lot uncovered something far darker, a mass grave filled with the skeletons of warriors who died during the Spanish siege. Their bones told a story the victors never recorded. Fractured skulls bore the marks of Spanish steel, but many also showed defensive wounds on their arms, proving these weren't helpless victims but fighters who resisted to the last breath. Even more revealing were the artifacts clutched in skeletal hands. Some warriors still gripped obsidian blades, their edges chipped from brutal close-quarter combat. Others wore copper rings looted from Spanish corpses, trophies taken in defiance. But the most haunting discovery came from soil analysis, traces of explosive residue mixed with charcoal. This wasn't just melee combat, it was a battlefield where indigenous warriors had tried to turn Spanish gunpowder against them, possibly igniting stockpiles in a final, desperate gambit. These finds didn't just confirm the violence of the siege, they revealed an Aztec adaptation to European warfare that history books had overlooked. Then there's the Temple Maya excavations, where in 2015 archaeologists found a cache of eagle warrior regalia buried beneath ritual offerings. The feathers were miraculously preserved, their vibrant blues and gold still visible after 5 centuries. But what stunned researchers wasn't their beauty, it was their arrangement. These weren't ceremonial costumes, they were battle-damaged. Leather straps showed repair stitches, and some helmets bore deep slash marks. This tangible evidence shattered the old stereotype of Aztec warriors as mere ritualistic fighters. These men were professionals who maintained their gear between engagements, suggesting a military culture as sophisticated as any in medieval Europe. Perhaps the most paradigm-shifting discovery came from Lake Texcoco's drained sediments. Using ground-penetrating radar, teams located the remnants of Spanish brigantines, but also hundreds of Aztec canoe hulls deliberately scuttled in defensive formations. These weren't the scattered wrecks of a panicked retreat. They were arranged in precise lines, some still loaded with stones meant to sink enemy vessels. This silent armada proved the Aztecs hadn't just fought on water. They'd engineered a naval strategy to counter Spanish ships, something no written account had ever detailed. But archaeology doesn't always confirm history, sometimes it appends it. For years, scholars assumed the Flower Wars were largely symbolic, based on Spanish descriptions of ceremonial battles. Then in 2021, a dig near Tlaxcala uncovered a battlefield littered with peculiar artifacts. Obsidian blades glued with tree resin instead of the usual twine, feather banners dyed crimson but lacking clan markings. These were weapons designed to maim rather than kill cleanly, and banners meant to terrify rather than identify. Forensic analysis of nearby remains showed horrific injuries, bones shattered in ways that suggested captives were deliberately crippled before being dragged away alive. This grisly find forced historians to reconsider the Flower Wars as far more brutal than the sanitized rituals described in colonial records. Every shovel of turned earth adds nuance to our understanding. When laser scans revealed hidden fortifications under Chapultepec Forest, they showed how Aztec engineers reshaped entire landscapes for defense, terraces designed to funnel attackers into kill zones, reservoirs positioned to flood enemy approaches. At the recently excavated site of Melanalco, carvings depict warriors using signal mirrors in formations identical to those described in Nahuatl poems long dismissed as exaggeration. Even pollen analysis plays a role. Sediment cores from battlefields prove Spanish accounts of burned maize fields were true, but also reveal Aztec forces retaliated by poisoning Spanish-held orchards with toxic nightshade. The greatest lesson from these discoveries isn't about who swung sharper blades or built stronger walls, it's about perspective. For centuries, the Aztec story was told by their conquerors. Now the dirt itself is speaking, and what it says changes everything. These shattered bones and scorched artifacts force us to see these battles not as predetermined triumphs or tragedies, but as moments of desperate improvisation, where warriors on both sides fought not just for land or gold, but for the survival of their worldviews. And in that shared struggle preserved under parking lots and city squares, we find not victors and vanquished, but human beings whose finest and most terrible hours are only now coming fully into view. Aztec warriors didn't carry weapons, they wielded extensions of their mythology. The iconic macuahutl, a wooden club embedded with razor-sharp obsidian blades, wasn't just a tool for war, it was a symbolic instrument of divine wrath. Each blade, crafted from volcanic glass with ritual precision, could decapitate a horse in one swing, a fact that stunned Spanish conquistadors, yet this legendary weapon had vulnerabilities. In prolonged battles against Tarascan copper axes or Spanish steel, the obsidian fractured, forcing warriors to rely on secondary arms like the tepes, a spear with obsidian points designed to punch through cotton armor. The duality of Aztec arms, devastating yet fragile, mirrored the empire itself, breathtakingly powerful yet perilously dependent on specific conditions to thrive. Defense was equally ingenious. While Spaniards scoffed at quilted cotton icahuapili armor, they soon learned its genius. Soaked in saltwater brine, these gambesons could deflect arrows and even absorb the impact of early musket balls at range. But the true masterpiece was in the details. Warriors tailored their armor to their environment, lighter versions for jungle skirmishes against the Maya, thicker padding for highland battles where sling stones rained like hail. Even their shields, decorated with animal totems, served psychological warfare, eagle designs to signal elite ranks, jaguar motifs to terrify superstitious foes. Tactics evolved like a living organism. Against the Tarascans, Aztec Quechua shock troops employed feigned retreats, a ploy borrowed from their enemy's playbook. When facing Tlaxcalan formations, they deployed smoke warriors who hurled burning copali resin into enemy lines, creating chaos for follow-up assaults. Naval warfare on Lake Texcoco revealed another layer of adaptability. Canoes weren't just transports, they were floating platforms for archers, their hulls stabilized with weighted nets to counteract recoil from atlatl dart volleys. The empire's greatest strength and fatal flaw was its ability to absorb foreign innovations without losing its cultural core. After early defeats to Spanish cavalry, Aztec smiths reforged captured swords into macuahutl hybrids with steel edges. They studied Tlaxcalan pit traps and improved them, lining concealed spikes with magi sap to cause septic wounds. But this flexibility had limits. Obsidian couldn't match steel's durability, just as ritual warfare couldn't comprehend total annihilation. The weapons that built an empire weren't the ones that could save it, proving that technological brilliance means little when the rules of war change overnight. Archaeology offers haunting testimony to this arms race. Excavated mass graves show skeletons with distinct trauma patterns, ribs shattered by cannon fire, skulls cleft by steel, but also Spanish remains with obsidian shards embedded in bone, proof that Aztec warriors died landing their own blows. The most poignant finds are the unfinished weapons, half-carved macuahutl clubs abandoned in workshops, their unset obsidian blades still waiting to taste battle. These silent relics speak louder than any chronicle, revealing an empire caught between tradition and transformation, its tools of war as beautifully flawed as the civilization that crafted them. To the Aztec warrior, every battle was a sacred performance, an act of devotion as much as destruction. Their religion didn't just influence warfare, it was warfare. Consider the Quetzalcoatl, the elite eagle and jaguar warriors who saw themselves as earthly avatars of the gods. Clad in feathered helmets and spotted pelts, they fought not for land or loot, but to reenact the cosmic struggle between Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird god of war, and the forces of darkness. Their obsidian blades weren't mere weapons, they were fragments of the stars mirroring the celestial weapons used by deities in their mythic battles. Even the act of taking prisoners had divine purpose. Captives became ixiptla, living embodiments of gods destined for sacrifice. Warfare wasn't just political, it was the engine that sustained the universe itself. Omens dictated every campaign. Before marching, priests scoured the night sky for signs, a comet streaking like a flaming spear, or the ominous Tlaxcala, the flaying of men constellation appearing at an inauspicious angle. The campaign against the Tarascans in 1510 was nearly abandoned when scouts reported hearing the ghostly wails of Cihuatateo, the spirits of women who died in childbirth, howling from the western mountains. Yet these signs weren't passive observations, they were active negotiations with the divine. If omens foretold disaster, priests performed counter-rituals, burning sacred copal resin to cleanse the warpath, or sacrificing blue-painted dogs to absorb impending misfortune. Ritual transformed even the battlefield into sacred ground. The Yeyayotl, the War of Flowers, saw armies meeting at predetermined sites like actors taking their marks. Before the first blow was struck, warriors would exchange ritual insults, invoking their patron deities. Combat followed strict protocols. Certain weapons were reserved for specific phases of battle, much like liturgical instruments in a religious ceremony. The chaos of melee was punctuated by priests blowing conch shells to mark transitions, their haunting blasts signaling shifts from skirmishing to full engagement. But this sacred framework had brutal consequences. When Moctezuma hesitated against Cortés, it wasn't weakness, it was theological whiplash. The emperor's astronomers had identified the Spanish arrival with the prophesied return of Quetzalcoatl, creating paralyzing doubt. Meanwhile, Spanish chaplains brandished crosses like weapons, deliberately desecrating Aztec war banners during battles to sever the spiritual tether between warriors and their gods. The psychological impact was devastating. Imagine a modern army cutting communication lines mid-battle. Archaeology unveils this sacred warfare symbiosis in chilling detail. Excavated Tezcatlipoca, the mirrors carried by commanders, still bear traces of hallucinogenic ointments, proof that generals entered battle in altered states, channeling divine visions. At the Templo Mayor, offerings contain miniature weapons alongside jade figurines, a literal arming of the gods. Most revealing are the mass graves at Xoltepec, where sacrificed Spanish captives were found with their bones rearranged to mimic Quetzalcoatl's serpent form. Even in defeat, the Aztecs waged metaphysical war, using ritual to reclaim power their steel could not. This fusion of faith and combat wasn't superstition, it was strategic depth. The Aztecs didn't just fight armies, they fought worldviews. When their gods fell silent under Spanish gunfire, it wasn't just a military collapse. It was the unraveling of a cosmos where war was prayer, and every victory kept the sun rising. Among the swirling dust of countless battles, a few names rise above the rest: warriors who didn't just fight for the Aztec Empire but became living legends, their deeds etched into the very stones of Tenochtitlan. Take Ahuitzotl, the 8th emperor, whose name means water beast, a fitting title for a man who waged war like a force of nature. During his reign from 1486 to 1502, he expanded the empire farther than any ruler before him, leading from the front with a ferocity that shocked both allies and enemies. His campaign against the Mixtecs wasn't just a military operation, it was psychological warfare. After capturing their king, he didn't execute him ceremonially. He forced the defeated ruler to kneel in Tenochtitlan's central plaza, where Ahuitzotl personally fed him a feast before sending him home unharmed. The message: resistance was futile, but surrender could be dignified. This blend of brutality and calculated mercy made him the most feared and strangely respected commander of his era. Then there's Tlajomulco, the Tlaxcalan warrior whose defiance turned him into an unlikely Aztec icon. Captured during a flower war, he refused to die as a mere sacrifice. When offered freedom for his valor, he demanded instead the chance to prove himself in gladiatorial combat. For an entire day, he fought wave after wave of Aztec champions, his obsidian blade flashing like lightning. So impressed was Moctezuma II that he granted Tlajomulco an honorable death, not on the sacrificial stone, but in a final duel against the empire's greatest fighter. His story became a lesson. Even enemies could embody the warrior ideal, their courage transcending allegiance. No discussion of Aztec martial brilliance would be complete without Cuauhtémoc, the last emperor and perhaps the most tragic figure of all. Barely 20 when he ascended the throne in 1520, he inherited a capital ravaged by smallpox and siege. Yet his defense of Tenochtitlan showcased tactical genius that still stuns historians. With Spanish cannons pounding the city, he ordered engineers to build underwater barricades of sharpened stakes to gut enemy boats. When food ran low, he had scouts distribute hallucinogenic mushrooms to warriors, numbing their hunger and pain. And in the final days, as Cortés closed in, Cuauhtémoc donned the garb of a common soldier, leading midnight raids to steal Spanish gunpowder. His ingenuity dragged the siege out for months, forcing the conquistadors to pay for every street in blood. But beyond the emperors, there were the unsung champions, women like Yeyecihuatl, the warrior woman, who commanded a battalion of female fighters during the Tarascan campaigns. Unlike the male eagle warriors, her unit specialized in night operations, their faces painted with crushed fireflies to glow faintly in the dark, a tactic that terrified enemies who believed them to be vengeful spirits. Or Tlaxcala, the master strategist who revolutionized Aztec logistics by creating a relay system of runners that could deliver battlefield messages faster than any Spanish horseman. His innovations turned the empire's armies into a coordinated machine capable of striking multiple fronts at once. These warriors shared more than skill. They embodied the Aztec concept of Yolteotl, heart of a god. It wasn't just about strength or even victory. It was the relentless pursuit of excellence, the willingness to face impossible odds with nothing but courage and cunning. Their legacies remind us that the Aztec Empire wasn't built on temples or gold alone, but on the backs of those who fought and often fell for a vision of greatness that still echoes across the centuries. Even in defeat, they proved that true martial prowess isn't just about conquest, it's about the unbreakable spirit behind every swing of the blade. History is a fabric woven with countless threads, but what if just one of those threads had been pulled differently? Imagine a world where Cortés' ships foundered in a Caribbean storm before reaching Mexico, or where Moctezuma's scouts had intercepted that first rumor of pale strangers and acted decisively. The Aztec Empire's fate hinged on dozens of pivotal moments where a single decision, a sudden storm, or an act of courage could have rewritten everything. Take the massacre at Colula in 1519, that infamous bloodbath where Spanish forces slaughtered thousands after suspecting treachery. What if the Tlaxcalan envoy's whispering warnings in Cortés' ear had been ignored? Without that preemptive strike, Colula's priests might have become allies instead of martyrs, funneling vital intelligence about Aztec defenses. The city's strategic position could have served as a fortified base for indigenous resistance, forcing the Spanish into a grueling siege long before they reached Tenochtitlan's gates. Without Colula's gold to fund his campaign, Cortés might have faced mutiny among his men, turning the conquest into a desperate retreat rather than a march toward empire. Then there's La Noche Triste, that chaotic Spanish retreat from Tenochtitlan where the Aztecs came agonizingly close to wiping out the invaders. Picture Cuauhtémoc's warriors pressing their advantage instead of prioritizing prisoners for sacrifice. Had they focused on annihilation rather than ritual capture, the lake might have swallowed Cortés and his entire army that night. No surviving Spaniards would have meant no returning reinforcements, no alliances with rival city-states, and no smallpox-laden slaves to unleash a biological catastrophe. The Aztec Empire, though battered, could have rebuilt, studying captured Spanish weapons, adapting their tactics, and fortifying their borders against future incursions. But the most tantalizing what-if lies in the Aztecs' own hands. Suppose Moctezuma had never let Cortés into Tenochtitlan at all. Instead of hosting the Spanish as guests, the emperor could have marshaled his armies at the causeways, forcing them to fight street by street just to reach the city center. Without that fateful invitation, the psychological advantage would have remained with the Aztecs. Spanish guns and horses were fearsome, but they weren't invincible, as proven when indigenous forces later adapted, using swampy terrain to neutralize cavalry and ambushes to exploit slow reload times. A united Mesoamerica, warned and ready, might have turned the conquest into a protracted war of attrition, one where European diseases burned out in isolated pockets rather than decimating entire populations. The ripple effects of these alternate histories stretch far beyond battlefields. A surviving Aztec empire could have reshaped global trade, funneling new world wealth through indigenous networks rather than Spanish galleons. Nahuatl, not Spanish, might have become the lingua franca of the Americas, and without the precedent of Mexico's rapid fall, other European powers may have hesitated before invading the Inca or Maya, leading to a hemisphere where indigenous civilizations negotiated with colonizers as equals rather than subjects. Of course, these scenarios are speculation, but they reveal the fragile hinges on which history swings. The Aztec Empire's fall wasn't inevitable. It was the product of specific choices, miscalculations, and moments where luck tipped the scales. Next time you glimpse an eagle perched on a cactus, the symbol of Tenochtitlan's birth, consider how easily it might still be flying today. The Aztec art of war wasn't just about winning battles. It was a meticulous dance of strategy, psychology, and divine purpose honed over centuries of conflict. Unlike the rigid phalanxes of Greece or the disciplined legions of Rome, Aztec warfare thrived on flexibility, blending calculated brutality with deep spiritual symbolism. At its core lay a simple but devastating principle. War wasn't merely a tool of conquest, but a sacred covenant with the gods, where every victory fed the sun and every defeat revealed divine will. This philosophy shaped everything from their weaponry to their diplomacy, creating a military culture as unique as the empire itself. What set the Aztecs apart was their mastery of asymmetric warfare long before the term existed. Against the Tarascan's copper blades, they used psychological terror, painting captives in the colors of sacrificial victims before releasing them to spread panic. When facing the Spanish cavalry, they dug hidden pits lined with obsidian spikes to cripple horses. Even their famed flower wars, often dismissed as mere ritual, were strategic master strokes, training grounds disguised as ceremonies where young warriors honed skills against seasoned opponents without risking full-scale war. This ability to adapt foreign tactics while preserving their cultural identity made them unlike any other ancient military power. Compare their approach to Sun Tzu's art of war. While the Chinese strategist preached winning without fighting, the Aztecs believed fighting was winning so long as it served higher purposes. Their battles weren't just territorial, they were cosmological, ensuring the sun would rise by offering the gods a steady diet of captured warriors. Unlike the Mongols, who valued total annihilation, or the Assyrians, who relied on sheer terror, the Aztecs wielded fear and reverence in equal measure. A conquered city might lose its leaders to the sacrificial stone, but its artisans would be relocated to Tenochtitlan, its merchants allowed to keep trading. This blend of annihilation and assimilation kept rebellions rare until the Spanish arrived, yet for all its sophistication, Aztec strategy had fatal blind spots. Their reliance on capturing rather than killing enemies left them unprepared for the Spanish preference for total slaughter. Ritualistic battles like the Flower Wars nurtured formidable rivals like Tlaxcala, who later allied with Cortés. Most crucially, their entire military cosmology couldn't comprehend an enemy who fought without rules, one who saw their sacred temples as loot-filled vaults and their warrior codes as weaknesses to exploit. In the end, the Aztec art of war was both their greatest strength and their undoing, a system too brilliant for its time, yet too bound by tradition to survive the collision with a merciless new world. The legacy of their martial philosophy lingers in unexpected places. Modern guerrilla tactics owe a debt to Aztec innovations in terrain-based warfare, from their use of jungle camouflage to their psychological operations. Even their economic strategies, weakening enemies through controlled conflicts rather than outright destruction, foreshadowed contemporary notions of attrition warfare. But perhaps their most enduring lesson is this: No empire, no matter how mighty, can survive when its warriors fight the last war while their enemies invent the next. The Aztecs didn't just lose to Spanish steel, they were outmaneuvered by a future they couldn't ritualize, and outgunned by a world that no longer played by the rules of the sacred. The rise and fall of the Aztec Empire wasn't written in stone or gold. It was carved into the battlefields of 30 decisive clashes that shaped everything from its meteoric expansion to its catastrophic collapse. These weren't just conflicts, they were turning points where ambition met resistance, where tradition collided with innovation, and where the fragile balance between divine mandate and raw power was tested again and again. From the desperate skirmishes in the swamps of Lake Texcoco to the apocalyptic siege of Tenochtitlan, each battle wove another thread into the empire's fate, threads of ingenuity, hubris, and ultimately reckoning. Consider how these battles forged the Aztec identity. Early victories like the overthrow of the Tepenecs proved that a scattered people could unite under a shared destiny, transforming exiles into empire builders. The Flower Wars, for all their ritualized brutality, became a pressure valve and a training ground until they backfired, creating rivals like Tlaxcala, who would later help dismantle the very empire they'd helped temper. Campaigns in the Gulf Coast and the Huasteca revealed the Aztecs' genius for adaptation, whether fighting in steamy jungles or on open water, yet also exposed the limits of their reach. And the final, desperate clashes against the Spanish showed a civilization at its most resilient even as it faced weapons, tactics, and diseases it couldn't ritualize or absorb. The legacy of these battles isn't just about who won or lost, it's about the paradoxes they laid bare. The Aztecs built an empire that could dominate through both terror and trade, that could inspire awe and hatred in equal measure. Their military was sophisticated enough to engineer floating causeways and psychological warfare, yet bound by traditions that left them vulnerable to an enemy who fought without rules. They mastered the art of conquest but struggled with the science of control, leaving behind simmering resentments that would boil over when Cortés arrived. What endures isn't just the memory of their triumphs or defeats, but the lessons etched into their story. The Aztecs remind us that power is as fragile as obsidian, razor sharp yet brittle under unexpected pressure. They show how cultural collision can spark innovation just as easily as destruction, and how even the most brilliant strategies can unravel when the world changes overnight. Most hauntingly, they force us to confront the uncomfortable truth that history belongs not just to the strong, but to the adaptable. So as the dust settles on these battlefields, one question lingers. How might we remember the Aztecs differently if just a few of these clashes had tipped the other way? If the Tarascans had fallen instead of holding fast, giving the empire untapped copper mines and a secure western flank? If Moctezuma had crushed Cortés on the causeways rather than welcoming him as a guest? Or if the Aztecs themselves had abandoned ritual for total war sooner, turning their ingenuity fully against the invaders? The answers don't just lie in the past, they whisper to us about the fragile threads that weave empires and how easily they unravel when fate and force collide.